Welcome to English Diaries, where English becomes exciting today. We start the thrilling journey of one of history's most controversial figures, Adolf Hitler. Love him or hate him, his story is filled with dreams, failures, ambition, and power from a small boy with big dreams to a man who changed the world forever. This is the story of Adolf Hitler, like you've never heard before. Are you ready? Grab your headphones, sit back, and let's dive into this incredible tale that will improve your English and keep you hooked till the end. Adolf Hitler was born on April 20th, 1889, in the small Austrian town of Braunau am Inn. At first glance, nothing about his early life suggested greatness or disaster. His parents, Alois and Clara, lived a modest life, and like many families at the time, they faced everyday struggles. Young Adolf enjoyed simple things, wandering outdoors, sketching buildings, and imagining grand futures. He wasn't a child destined for power. He was simply a boy with creative interests and a stubborn personality. But inside the household, tension was always present. Alois, his father, was strict, firm to the point of cruelty at times, while Clara remained gentle, protective, and emotionally closer to her son. That tug-of-war between domination and affection shaped Hitler's personality in ways he didn't fully understand himself. When Hitler expressed his dream of becoming an artist, his father rejected the idea outright. Alois envisioned a stable government career for his son, something practical and predictable. Art is a hobby, not a profession, he would insist, often loudly and aggressively. Adolf, who rarely challenged authority openly, carried silent resentment. He began to drift away from schoolwork, losing interest in structure and rules. He still loved drawing, but that passion existed in the shadows of his father's expectations. When Alois died unexpectedly, many assumed the strict influence in Hitler's life had finally vanished. But the absence left a burden rather than freedom. Without guidance, Hitler became directionless. As he grew older, school became even less appealing. Teachers described him as intelligent but uninterested, capable but unwilling. He preferred daydreaming to homework, imagination to discipline. Eventually, he left school with no qualifications and few prospects. Still clinging to his artistic dreams, he moved to Vienna, believing the city of culture and architecture would embrace him. But the reality was harsh. His application to the Academy of Fine Arts was rejected twice. Each rejection felt like a personal attack, confirming his belief that the world did not recognize his true potential. Life in Vienna became increasingly difficult. He lived in cramped shelters, sold small sketches to tourists to survive, and spiraled into bitterness. During this period, he absorbed political ideas and prejudices circulating through the city, ideas that would later become woven into his extremist worldview. The death of his mother during this period pushed him deeper into isolation. That grief mixed with frustration, failure, and anger formed a dangerous emotional brew. Instead of accepting responsibility for his setbacks, he began blaming groups of people he barely understood. This habit of directing resentment outward rather than inward would follow him for the rest of his life. Understanding these early missteps is crucial because they show how unchecked emotions, resentment, and ideological influence can evolve into something far more destructive over time. But how did a struggling, frustrated young man with no stable future transform into a rising political figure who could rally massive crowds? The answer begins in the chaos of a world at war, leading directly into the next chapter of this unsettling journey. The next turning point in Adolf Hitler's life came not from personal ambition, but from global conflict. In 1914, World War I erupted across Europe, pulling nations into battles unlike anything the world had ever seen. For countless young men, The war offered a sense of purpose, belonging, and direction. For Hitler, who had spent years drifting between disappointment and poverty, it felt like a chance to finally attach his identity to something greater. When he volunteered to join the German army, he believed he was stepping into the destiny he had been denied elsewhere. Suddenly, he wasn't just an artist rejected by an academy. He was a soldier defending what he imagined to be a noble cause. The war gave his life a structure he had long been missing. During the war, Hitler served primarily as a messenger, running across dangerous battlefields to deliver information between military units. This was often a deadly job, yet he performed it with commitment, earning medals for bravery. The front lines hardened him, shaping his worldview through violence, loss, and constant tension. Many soldiers returned from the war disillusioned and broken, but Hitler left with a different reaction. Rather than seeing the chaos as a warning about the futility of conflict, he absorbed it as justification for strength, obedience, and nationalism. And when Germany eventually lost the war in 1918, his emotional response was explosive. Devastated and furious, he convinced himself that betrayal, not military defeat, was responsible for Germany's collapse. That belief later became a cornerstone of his ideology. Returning to civilian life was another harsh awakening. Germany, after the war, was a nation in freefall. The economy was shattered, food was scarce, and millions were unemployed. People felt humiliated by the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, which forced Germany to pay massive reparations. Amid this suffering, citizens searched desperately for someone to blame and someone to follow. In this environment, radical ideas spread quickly, and Hitler, with his growing conviction and personal frustration, found his opportunity. He joined a tiny political group known as the German Workers' Party, a party so small at the time that its meetings were barely attended. But what it lacked in size, it possessed in one advantage: a platform for Hitler to speak. Hitler quickly discovered that he had a natural talent for public speaking. His voice, which could shift from calm persuasion to loud intensity, captured attention. Crowds, at first small and skeptical, began listening closely to his emotionally charged speeches. He spoke not as a politician, but as someone who claimed to represent the pain and anger of ordinary Germans. He repeated a simple message: Germany had been wronged, and only unity under a strong leader could restore its dignity. This message resonated deeply with people who felt abandoned by their government and crushed by their circumstances. It wasn't long before Hitler's influence expanded beyond the party's founders, making him the center of attention. Recognizing his growing presence, Hitler reshaped the German Workers' Party into something far more ambitious. He renamed it the National Socialist German Workers' Party, soon known worldwide as the Nazi Party, and redesigned its image, including its now infamous symbol. With each speech, rally, and public appearance, Hitler refined his strategy: promise hope, ignite anger, identify enemies, and present himself as the answer. The rhetorical pattern worked. The Nazi movement grew, attracting people who were desperate for direction, economic relief, and a sense of national pride. By the early 1920s, Hitler's influence was undeniable. Yet the path he was carving was far more dangerous than many realized. His speeches were not just political messages, they were emotional weapons. His ideas weren't just promises, they were seeds of division. And his rising popularity suggested that Germany, wounded and directionless, was vulnerable to extreme solutions. But how did this small party, built on fiery speeches and wounded pride, attempt to seize control of an entire nation? The answer lies in one bold, reckless decision, one that would change Hitler's life forever. As Hitler's influence grew inside the newly renamed Nazi Party, His ambitions expanded far beyond speeches and street gatherings. By 1923, he had convinced himself that Germany was ready for a dramatic shift in power, one that he believed he alone could orchestrate. He looked at the political chaos, the economic collapse, and the public's frustration and imagined that a bold move could place him at the center of a national transformation. His plan? To overthrow the Bavarian government by force, march to Berlin, and seize control of the entire country. It was reckless, dangerous, and deeply unrealistic, but Hitler believed destiny was on his side. This moment would become known as the Beer Hall Putsch. On the evening of November 8th, 1923, Hitler and hundreds of his followers stormed into a large beer hall in Munich, where local leaders were holding a political meeting. Armed men surrounded the building. Hitler fired a shot into the ceiling to shock the audience and declare that the national revolution had begun. His voice boomed with confidence. But behind the bravado lay one crucial problem. He didn't have the military support he claimed. He believed that if he acted boldly enough, others would simply join. But revolutions are not built on imagination. They require power, organization, and strategy, none of which he truly possessed at the time. The next morning, Hitler and his followers marched through Munich in an attempt to rally public support. Instead of cheering crowds, they encountered armed police. Gunfire erupted. In minutes, the march collapsed. 16 Nazi supporters were killed, the revolution failed, and the fantasy of a quick takeover dissolved. Hitler, who had imagined himself rising triumphantly, instead fled the scene and hid until he was arrested. His attempt to seize power had ended in humiliation. Yet, ironically, this failure would become one of the most important events of his life. During his trial, Hitler had an unexpected opportunity, a national platform. Newspapers covered every word he said, turning him from a fringe agitator into a politically recognizable figure. Rather than deny his actions, he framed them as patriotic. He claimed he was acting for Germany's future, arguing that the government, not him, was the source of the country's suffering. Many Germans, frustrated with the state of the nation, found themselves listening carefully. The trial, which should have ruined him, instead amplified his influence. Hitler was sentenced to 5 years in prison, but he only served about 9 months. Months that became pivotal for his transformation. In prison, Hitler decided that force alone wasn't enough to seize power. He needed ideology, structure, and a strategy that could legally place him at the top. During his confinement, he began writing a book that blended autobiography, propaganda, and political theories. Mein Kampf, meaning my struggle. The book outlined his worldview, including extreme nationalism, distorted ideas about racial purity, and a vision for a future German empire. Disturbingly, many readers found his ideas persuasive, especially those who felt betrayed by Germany's defeat in the war. By the time he left prison, Hitler had evolved from an angry agitator into someone with a clearer, though deeply dangerous, political blueprint. Once released, he returned to a party that had been temporarily banned and largely scattered. But Hitler rebuilt it with new energy. He reorganized the Nazi Party into a structured political machine, complete with uniforms, rallies, propaganda teams, youth organizations, and paramilitary groups. Germany's economic situation worsened through the 1920s, and with every crisis, high unemployment, inflation, hunger, Hitler gained more followers. People weren't just hearing his speech anymore. They were buying into a movement that promised strength, pride, and revival. And the more desperate Germany became, the faster the movement grew. But how did this once failed revolutionary rise from prison to eventually take control of an entire nation? The next phase of his ascent shows how fear, economic collapse, and political chaos opened the door wider than anyone expected. As the 1920s drew to a close, Germany entered a period of extreme instability that would reshape its political landscape entirely. The global economic crash of 1929, known as the Great Depression, struck Germany harder than nearly any other country. Businesses collapsed, banks failed, and millions of people suddenly found themselves unemployed. Savings evaporated, hunger spread, and despair settled over the nation like a heavy fog. It was in this environment of desperation and uncertainty that Adolf Hitler found the opening he had long been waiting for. The Nazi Party, once small and scattered, now positioned itself as the one force capable of restoring order and dignity. Hitler crafted a message that blended hope with fear, promising renewal while targeting scapegoats. For a struggling population, that message became dangerously appealing. Unlike before, Hitler no longer relied on force or chaotic leaps of ambition. He understood that the legal path to power would be far more effective than marches and riots. So he adapted. The Nazi Party became highly organized, operating like a modern political machine. Propaganda filled newspapers, posters, and radio broadcasts, portraying Hitler as a strong, disciplined leader capable of rescuing Germany from ruin. Massive rallies were staged with precision, designed to create emotional unity among desperate crowds. Uniforms, symbols, and carefully choreographed presentations made the movement feel larger, more powerful, and more disciplined than it truly was. People who had lost trust in traditional politicians found themselves drawn to the certainty Hitler projected. At the same time, Hitler expanded his influence through a network of loyal groups. The SA, stormtroopers, patrolled the streets, intimidating opponents and creating an illusion of control. The Hitler Youth attracted young boys with promises of camaraderie and national pride. Women were targeted with messages about family, duty, and rebuilding German society. Every group received messaging tailored to its needs. Hitler didn't simply build a party. He built a psychological environment in which people felt they belonged to something historic, something revitalizing, something unbreakable. Germany's political system, already weakened, struggled to contain the rising extremism. Multiple political parties fought constantly, unable to agree on solutions for the economic crisis. Government coalitions collapsed again and again, leaving Germany without strong leadership. The more chaotic the government became, the stronger Hitler looked by comparison. He painted himself as the one man who could restore unity. Many voters, frustrated and afraid, chose him not because they fully believed in his ideology, but because they were desperate for stability. Fear can be a powerful force, and Hitler used it masterfully. In 1932, the Nazi Party became the largest political party in Germany, though it still lacked the majority needed to rule alone. Hitler demanded the position of chancellor, the most powerful office in the government. At first, President Paul von Hindenburg resisted. He distrusted Hitler and hoped he would eventually lose momentum. But political pressure, backroom deals, and a belief among conservative elites that they could control Hitler led to a critical mistake. On January 30th, 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. What many officials viewed as a strategic compromise quickly became the beginning of a total transformation of the nation. Once in power, Hitler acted swiftly. He passed laws that weakened freedom of speech, restricted civil rights, and targeted political opponents. Newspapers and radio stations came under state control. Rival parties were dissolved. Hitler portrayed these changes as necessary steps to restore order, and many Germans, overwhelmed by economic crisis, accepted them. But beneath the promises of stability, something far darker was growing. Hitler was not interested in leading a democracy. He intended to dismantle it entirely. But how did Hitler transform his newly gained authority into an absolute dictatorship? And how did this shift lead Germany into its most devastating chapter? The next part reveals how power, once seized, was used to reshape the nation and ignite global conflict. Once Adolf Hitler secured the position of chancellor, the transformation of Germany accelerated at a pace that stunned the world. What began as political authority swiftly evolved into something far more dangerous: total control. Hitler exploited fear, uncertainty, and national pride to reshape the entire government. After the Reichstag building mysteriously burned in February 1933, he used the crisis as justification to demand extraordinary emergency powers. These powers allowed him to arrest political opponents, silence critics, and dismantle democratic structures under the claim of protecting the nation. A few months later, the Enabling Act was passed, granting Hitler absolute legislative authority. Parliament still existed in name, but its power had become meaningless. With a single vote, democracy in Germany had essentially vanished. From that point forward, Hitler focused on redesigning German society based on his ideology. Opposition voices were erased, often violently. The Gestapo, the secret police, monitored civilians, creating an atmosphere of fear where anyone could be arrested for even the smallest suspicion of disloyalty. The SS grew into a powerful organization, controlling everything from policing to concentration camps. Education, newspapers, films, and radio broadcasts were all filtered through the Nazi lens. Children learned songs praising Hitler, families displayed Nazi symbols, and communities internalized propaganda without realizing how deeply it shaped their thinking. Many believed they were witnessing the rebirth of a stronger Germany. In reality, they were witnessing the erasure of freedom. As Hitler consolidated power within Germany, he began preparing for something far more expansive: military domination. Factories were directed to produce weapons, aircraft, and tanks at unprecedented rates. Young men were drafted into the army, and Hitler's speeches echoed across rally grounds, promising the rise of a new empire. Germany's neighbors watched anxiously, aware that Hitler's ambitions extended far beyond his borders. In 1939, these fears became reality when Hitler ordered the invasion of Poland. Europe was thrust into its second devastating war within a single generation. World War II had begun, and the consequences would reach every corner of the globe. In the early years of the war, Hitler's strategy appeared remarkably successful. German forces moved with speed and precision, capturing territory after territory. His military victories fed his confidence and convinced many followers that his leadership was unstoppable. But behind the public triumphs, Hitler pursued a horrifying campaign of brutality. He carried out his long-promised plan to eliminate Jewish communities and other groups he deemed undesirable. Millions of innocent people, men, women, and children, were imprisoned, tortured, and murdered in concentration camps. This genocide, known as the Holocaust, became one of the darkest and most tragic chapters in human history. It showed the catastrophic result of unchecked hatred, racial ideology, and authoritarian power. Why 1943? However, the tide of war turned against Hitler. The Allies, led by countries like the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union, grew stronger and more coordinated. German soldiers, once advancing confidently, now retreated under relentless pressure. Cities across Germany were bombed, supply lines collapsed, and morale crumbled. Hitler, once charismatic and commanding, became increasingly paranoid and isolated. He distrusted his own generals, refused to accept strategic advice, and insisted on fighting battles that were already lost. His belief in victory became delusion, and that delusion cost countless more lives. That be why early 1945, Berlin was encircled. Hitler retreated into an underground bunker, clinging to the final remnants of his collapsing empire. As the Soviet forces closed in, he made his final decisions. On April 30th, 1945, he ended his life alongside his wife, Eva Braun, whom he had married just one day earlier. Within a week, Germany surrendered, and the war in Europe came to an end. The world emerged from the conflict wounded, grieving, and determined to prevent such devastation from ever happening again in the aftermath. Hitler's legacy became a universal warning. How dangerous a single individual can become when given power, loyalty, and unchallenged authority. His story serves as a reminder that democracy, compassion, and unity must always be protected. History teaches us not just what happened, but what can happen when fear triumphs over understanding and hatred replaces humanity. Now that you've witnessed how one man reshaped history, for better or worse, you may be wondering, what lessons can be learned from such a dark chapter, and how can we apply them to the world we live in today? If you want, we can explore that next.